Hello, Andy Strong here, and welcome back to the Fundamentally Fit podcast with me, your host, Andy Strong. And a good morning, good afternoon, or good evening to wherever it is that you are listening to this week's podcast. If you're listening to us on your walk, hello, I hope it's sunny. If you're listening to us on the train, I hope you've got a seat. And if you are watching us on YouTube, because yes, we do video this podcast, you can catch up on the internet. If you are watching on YouTube, I'm waving, hello, and as Aussie man would say, here's my face. So we are back for episode number, I think we're 49 or 50. I think it's 49. We are in podcast in May, basically. The numbers don't really matter. We've got a few things on the agenda today that we're going to be having a chat about over the next 15 minutes or 14, because I've been talking for one of them. We're going to be talking about Kim Kardashian, and yes, I did just say that we are talking about Kim Kardashian on the Fundamentally Fit podcast for very good reason, and thankfully it's not because she's been taking her clothes off again, although she has done something else which is equally reckless. We're also going to be talking about the Body Type Nutrition, or the BTN conference. This was a conference that I attended over the weekend. I was attending as one of their guest speakers. I'm going to tell you a little bit about my experience. Very excited to be there, Mr. Ben Coomber. And I'm also going to be talking a little bit about one of my clients, George, and I'm going to be telling you a little bit about how I've worked with George and helped him lose 9 stone over the last 18 months. And it was actually George who I was there to talk about and present about at the conference. So, nearly 2 minutes in, let's kick off with our first story. Let's get Kim out of the way. Let's get Kim Kardashian off the podcast, off the books, because I don't really want to talk about this, but we do need to, because she's done something rather silly. So you may have seen this one, you may have picked this one up, because it did get quite a lot of traction on online last week. Basically, I'm citing a Huffington Post article, but she uploaded a photo onto Instagram of her eating a lollipop, advertising a third-party company that was selling said lollipop. The only problem is that these lollipops are allegedly appetite suppressant, which then basically led to a lot of backlash for Kim. It then led to Instagram taking the photo down, although they later claimed that this was a mistake before they posted it back up, and basically has left the situation where she's actually promoting appetite suppressant lollipops as part of her weight loss routine. Now, the website of the company in question actually in the small print says that none of its claims have actually been evaluated by the Food and Drug Administration in the US, which is where this product's from. So none of its claims have actually been validated anyway. Let's get that out of the way first and foremost. It claims to have an extract from a saffron extract called Saterial, which works to maximize satiety, help control food intake, cravings, and weight. So that's the claims around this product. There's a few issues with this. First and foremost, let's get rid of the fact that this product might or might not work. It doesn't, because none of its claims have been verified. Even if it did work, theoretically, here's the big issue. You might be able to suppress your appetite, but you still do have a calorie requirement for the day, and you can't suppress it beyond a certain point, so you're probably more likely to suppress it for a period of time and then overconsume at the other end of that process, in all reality, unless you've got a diet regime, a plan in place to know what you're going to eat. This isn't going to help you change your eating habits, and if your eating habits and routine are fundamentally unhealthy, then a lollipop is not going to change that for you in the very, 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 very vast majority of cases. That out of the way, the bigger issue with this is that, according to the Huffington Post, Kim Kardashian's social media following is around 111 million. And this is the bigger issue, is that celebrities like this have a lot of influence, a lot of credibility with their audience, and therefore they can easily sell and recommend products like this. It's partly how they fund their living, make their living, and do the things that they do. The big issue here is that a lot of this market, a lot of this social media following will be young girls who are going to be more impressionable, who are going to be more susceptible to weight issues anyway, and actually disorderly eating and things like that. And this is quite a reckless thing to do, in my opinion, and in the opinion of a lot of people who actually kicked back when this photo went up. I don't really want to talk about this anymore, because it's not a good story. It's not coming from a good place. But Kim, keep your clothes on and put your lollies away. Nobody cares, basically. Right, 5 minutes in, let's jump into the main part of the podcast. So I had the very great pleasure at the weekend of attending the Body Type Nutrition Conference, or the BTN Academy Conference as it's now known. They haven't held this conference for a little while, and I was very excited to be attending anyway. And then I was asked if I would come and speak as part of their graduated coaches coming back to educate the current students who are going through the course. So I decided that I wanted to talk about my client George and how I've managed to help him lose 9 stone over the last 18 months. The presentation went really, really well. I was quite nervous because I was the first ex-student or I was the first coach or ex-student to be presenting. So we had a very interesting presentation on fat shaming and is it a real thing from Tom Bainbridge, who's one of the course creators. That was really, really interesting, looking at it from very, very different angles that I hadn't really considered. So really enjoyed that. And then I was the first one up. So I was quite nervous, but I really, really enjoyed it. It went really well. Students were really receptive to it. I got lots of questions, lots of really nice feedback, and then I had the pleasure of listening to some really, really good presentations for the rest of the day as well. And then I got to sit on the coaches panel at the end of the day and take questions from the audience. And I think that was probably the most challenging part, because kind of being put on the spot with some of the bigger questions, because the presentation I prepared, I've been working with George for so long, I know it inside out, and actually that was relatively straightforward for me, but the more challenging questions came at the end, when it was things about direction of your business, advice for how you work with certain types of clients. And I enjoyed that. But it was definitely more challenging being put on the spot to answer certain questions. But hopefully I'll get to go back to the Academy again in the future and present. Hopefully be the first of many presentations for me like that, because I love doing it. If you've got an event coming up and you're looking for someone to present, then please do get in touch. I would love to get involved. But the topic that I was talking about was actually my client George. And so I've been working with George for about 18 months. And when George came to me, he was 29 stone. And he was only 25 at the time. And he needed to obviously lose weight for health. Now, he was currently living with a friend, living over the top of a takeaway, living over the top of 2 takeaways just down the road from the pub, and he had a lot of challenges. He was struggling to walk up the stairs very effectively, without being out of breath. He couldn't walk very far without his back hurting him. And we had to do a lot of work educating him on his diet to help him start moving forward. One of the first things that we got George to do was actually consider his home environment, and it's actually something I've talked about a lot on here, is your home environment and the impact it has on you. And for George, this was quite toxic because he wasn't cooking an awful lot. He was living off of fast food, and actually he needed to be in an environment that enabled him to be successful. So when his tenancy came to an end, he decided he was going to move back home and get some more support from his family, which was a really sensible idea, and it had a massive impact on his progress. We started really educating George purely on a nutrition basis, because that was the support that he needed to make progress. We did a little bit of exercise, but there's a limit to what he could really manage that was helpful, because what we could do would just make him so sore that actually it was more benefit for him tidying up his diet. And at the start, a lot of that you would think you need to make massive changes, but in reality it was the small changes that added up. So for him it was cutting out those takeaways, because that saved an awful lot of calories over a week. It was swapping his fizzy drinks for sugar-free options, and again this might not be the healthiest choice ultimately, but they were good stepping stones to get him towards drinking more plain water. And actually, in terms of calories and calorie deficit, this was enough to take George from a point where he was putting maybe 3, 4, 5 pound a week on to actually starting to lose that very, very steadily. As kind of George went through the process and he kind of started losing steady weight, we were then able to introduce exercise, which really sped things up and was really helpful. But we also had to do a lot of other things in terms of educating George on reading food labels, educating him on the impact of different types of food, so how the sugar that he was eating, which at the time was very, very high, but how that was impacting on his energy levels, how we could understand the difference between his carbs and his fats and his proteins to actually balance out his meals more sensibly, and all of these things over a period of time have a really, really big impact. Now, something that we did do with him was that we actually did a couple of trips around the supermarket. And it's not something I normally do. I've done it a couple of times with clients that live locally, but it's not something I normally do. But it did have a big impact because it meant we could compare like for like. So we could see the things that George was eating, things that he wasn't perhaps eating that would be healthier, and we could compare them on the spot, teach him how the food labels are sometimes prepared in a way to make things look healthier than they really are, and actually to see what one type of food looks like when you compare it to another, and how much you can actually eat, and actually do that direct comparison of healthy versus unhealthy and what that looks like in terms of volume of food. And all of these things over a year-long period helped him lose around 6.5 stone. And at this point, things took a little bit of a turn for George because he became very unwell. And he was in hospital multiple times through the start of last year. And it got to the point where he was taken into hospital, and he was eventually diagnosed with heart failure at 26 years old. Now, for George, understandably, this was really scary, but it was primarily down to the fact that he was diagnosed with sleep apnea. And this was due to the fact that he was very obese, very overweight. And the added pressure around his neck meant that his airway was collapsing when he lies down. Now, thankfully, he was diagnosed with sleep apnea, and that meant that he now wears what's called a CPAP machine when he sleeps. So it basically inflates his airway so he can get enough oxygen. And now he's getting enough oxygen, his heart, and due to medication as well, his heart's now started to return to the normal size. Now, his heart had actually enlarged due to the fact that his airway was collapsing when he was sleeping, and he wasn't getting enough oxygen in his blood. So as a reaction to this, the heart had got bigger to try and pump more blood. Problem is, there was no more oxygen in that blood because he wasn't getting enough oxygen. When they actually took him into hospital, his lung function was down to, I think it was around 37%. So it was very, very low. He was not in a great place. Thankfully, he'd lost 6.5 stone at that point. Otherwise, I think things would have been a lot more serious, shall we say. Now, this didn't hold George back, because as soon as he was on the mend, we did a lot more education on things like salt, because water retention and heart function became an even bigger consideration for him. But as soon as he was able to, we've got him back into exercise, back onto educating him around his diet, and he's managed to drop his weight down to 20 stone. So he's 9 stone off. He's doing really, really well. He's off on holiday soon, moving in with his new girlfriend quite soon as well. So he's done really, really well. He's been a pleasure to work with. We've still got more work to do. We're not stopping yet, but it was a pleasure to be able to go and share George's story and how I actually worked with him, and actually share some of the knowledge that I've picked up along the way with some of the new and aspiring coaches. So big thank you really to George for trusting me to help him, because I've loved working with him and he's done phenomenally well. But also big thank you to Ben and the BTN community, because it was a pleasure to be able to come and present. It was a pleasure to be able to come and join in with the community, and I absolutely love being able to share that story and the things that I've learned with the new and aspiring coaches. So it's something I'm hoping to do a lot more of. I love to present, I love to share the energy, I love to educate, and I think being in front of people is the best way possible to do that. So that was my weekend. I had a fantastic time. Hopefully I'll get to be involved with something with Ben in the future, but for now that was the BTN conference, and that is podcast number 49 or 50, whichever number we are this week. I hope you've enjoyed this week's podcast. Get out, enjoy the weather over the weekend. Don't go out there and buy some of those appetite suppressant lollipops, because that would be a silly thing to do. But go over and check out Facebook. There's a few photos there from the conference. I will be receiving the full presentation that I did hopefully later this week from Ben and the team. I'll be sharing that probably on LinkedIn, probably over on YouTube as well. I'll try and make a shorthand version of it so people can get the gist of the presentation. So please do go and check that out. If you're enjoying the podcast, if you're over on iTunes, please give us a bit of feedback. Let us know what you're thinking. Give us some positive stuff. That's always good to know people are enjoying what we're doing, because if we don't, then it's the best way to keep the podcast on the air is to let us know you're enjoying it. You can always send an email to andy@fundamentallyfit.co.uk. You can send us a question. If it's a good question, we'll feature it on the main headline for the podcast. If you're on iTunes, if you're on SoundCloud, give us some love. If you're on Facebook, always come and say hello, or you can even leave us a review and say what you think of the podcast, as long as it's nice. And I will be back same time next week, hopefully very well rested after the bank holiday weekend. Right, that is episode number 49 or 50. Have a great weekend. Look forward to speaking to you soon. I am Andy Strong with the Fundamentally Fit podcast, and I will see you next time. Goodbye, Internet.